Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into the soft, candlelit corridors of royal courts. The kind of places where velvet rustled, jewels glittered faintly, and everyone smelled faintly of either roses or unwashed laundry, depending on how close you were to the king. And while kings had wives usually pale, long-suffering women imported from a politically useful corner of Europe, they also had mistresses. A whole unofficial department of them. Some were dazzlingly ambitious, some genuinely loved, and others just happened to be standing in the right hallway when the king grew tired of chess. But here's the question no one really lingers on. What happened to these mistresses when the king died? The answer is, unsurprisingly, rarely glamorous. One day you're being serenaded by courtiers, the next you're trying to pawn a necklace just to afford bread rolls. So, let's wander gently through a few centuries and peek at what became of these royal favorites once the royal heart stopped beating. No cliffhangers, no high drama, just the quiet unraveling of influence as mistresses turned into widows of a throne they never sat on. Imagine first the medieval scene. A king dies. Bells toll across the city. The queen, resplendent in black veils, takes her place as the grieving centerpiece of the court. And the mistress? She's probably told to leave. Immediately. Sometimes with a polite note, sometimes with a boot. Because once the king was gone, her usefulness was gone too. One of the earliest well-documented cases is Alice Perrers, mistress of Edward III of England in the 14th century. Alice began life not as a duchess, nor even as a lady of high breeding, but probably the daughter of a local merchant. Somehow, through the mysterious mathematics of charm plus opportunity, she became the king's favorite companion in his later years, and she was very good at it. She managed to accumulate jewels, estates, and a reputation for talking over lawyers in court to sway cases in her favor. Imagine a medieval influencer, but instead of sponsored perfumes, she had royal charters. When Edward died in 1377, though, Alice's fortunes collapsed like a badly baked pie. Parliament actually passed a law banishing her from court, citing her corrupting influence. She was stripped of wealth, titles, and dignity in one smooth sweep. Of course, she fought back with lawsuits, as one does, but the glow of power had gone out forever. Without Edward's affection, she was simply an ambitious widow with too many enemies. This was the usual pattern. Mistresses enjoyed sunshine only as long as their patron shone. Once he dimmed, so did they. Across the Channel, in France, things could be a little softer, but not by much. French kings practically institutionalized the mistress role, giving us the famous maîtresse en titre, the official, state-recognized leading mistress. You might think this position came with a pension plan. It didn't. Take, for instance, Agnès Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France in the 15th century. Known as the most beautiful woman in France, she set fashion trends by bearing one breast in court gowns, statement that probably kept courtiers very alert during long ceremonies. Agnès was showered with diamonds, which was unusual because diamonds were considered too precious for anyone but royalty. But when she died suddenly, possibly poisoned, her daughters didn't inherit much protection. They had noble blood, but not the kind that mattered, and Agnès herself was left as more a cautionary tale than a revered widow. The jewels? Gone. The political influence? Gone. Even the trend of single-breast fashion faded quickly. Fast forward a few centuries to the lush courts of the 17th and 18th centuries. Now the role of mistress had expanded into something almost bureaucratic. In Louis XV's Versailles, being a mistress wasn't just a bedroom role, it was a career track. There were hierarchies, apartments, official recognition, and even rivalries managed like office politics. The most famous was Madame de Pompadour. She wasn't merely a mistress, she was a minister in satin. She arranged cultural policy, patronized artists, and even helped shape military decisions. Pompadour, to her credit, anticipated the problem of royal mortality. She cleverly transitioned from lover to friend and advisor, ensuring that even after her romantic influence waned, she kept her apartments, her pensions, and her status. When Louis XV finally died, she had already departed the stage gracefully, which was rare. Others weren't so lucky. Madame du Barry, Louis XV's last mistress, lingered too long in the limelight. When the French Revolution erupted, no one cared that she was technically just a royal companion. She had enjoyed jewels, balls, and diamonds. That was enough to mark her as guilty of enjoying life at the people's expense. She was sent to the guillotine in 1793, reportedly begging the executioner, "Encore un moment, monsieur." One more moment. But no, the blade fell anyway. Her downfall was as spectacular as her rise had been effortless. In England, the Stuart and Hanoverian monarchs provided similar cautionary tales. Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch, had a whole bouquet of mistresses. Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille. It was less a romantic drama than an ever-rotating season of a courtly soap opera. While Charles lived, they thrived. Barbara Villiers in particular was notorious for demanding and receiving enormous sums of money, jewels, and even a dukedom for one of her children. But when Charles died in 1685, the new monarch James II wasn't nearly as generous. Barbara found herself heavily in debt, pawning jewels she once wore to glittering masks. Nell Gwynn, the witty actress who had been Charles's favorite, survived a little longer on the goodwill of the people. She was considered the people's mistress thanks to her humor and relative humility. But even she eventually slipped into obscurity and financial trouble. Mistresses, it turned out, didn't get retirement packages. They just got silence. The dynamic was simple. Queens had legal security, even if they were miserable. Mistresses had excitement, influence, and attention, but only on lease. Once the king was gone, their lease expired instantly. Some managed clever marriages after the fact, snagging lesser nobles or wealthy courtiers to keep them comfortable. Others simply faded away, their jewels scattered in pawn shops, their names reduced to footnotes. It's worth noting that a few kings did try to provide for their favorites. Wills sometimes left property or stipends, but royal wills were notoriously easy to overturn. If the heir didn't like the mistress, and usually they didn't, the inheritance evaporated like morning mist. After all, she was living proof of their father's divided affections. Hardly the kind of person you welcome with open arms at your coronation banquet. And sometimes the fall wasn't just financial, but social. A mistress could go from commanding respect to being treated like an embarrassing scandal overnight. Courtiers who once bowed deeply would pass her in the hallway with a glance that said, "Who, you?" This sudden shift must have been disorienting. Imagine going to bed with the power to make or break careers and waking up to find you can't even secure a decent chair at the court chapel. The cruelest irony is that many mistresses were smarter, sharper, and far more interesting than the queens they replaced in affection. But intelligence was no safeguard. they had no title that could outlast the king's pulse. So, what happened to royal mistresses when the king died? In short, they were erased. Sometimes elegantly, sometimes brutally, but always inevitably. A few slipped into comfortable obscurity with pensions and houses. More often, they faced banishment, lawsuits, poverty, or even execution if the political winds shifted hard enough. The lesson, if there is one, is that royal favor was as fleeting as candlelight in a drafty hall. It burned bright, it dazzled, and then suddenly it was out. And once out, no one bothered to relight it. Let's drift now to another corner of dynastic misfortune. Because if mistresses faded quickly, royal bloodlines themselves often unraveled slowly, painfully, and with spectacularly awkward results. So, we've seen what happened to royal mistresses when the king died. Spoiler, it usually wasn't pretty. Now let's dim the lights a little further and wander into another shadowy royal hallway. This time, not about mistresses, but about daughters, princesses, duchesses, queens, the women who carried dynasties forward. More accurately, sometimes dragged them sideways into medical catastrophe. Because medieval Europe had one consistent obsession: keeping property in the family. Unfortunately, they took that phrase almost literally. Marriages between cousins, uncles and nieces, even closer pairings if the paperwork could be finessed, it was all part of the grand dynastic strategy. The result? Some of the most famous and unfortunate cases of inbreeding in history. And tonight, instead of shocking cliffhangers or medical horror, we'll simply drift through these lives, quietly, slowly, letting the absurdity of dynastic planning reveal itself, one pale and fragile royal child at a time. Let's start with perhaps the most infamous dynasty, the Habsburgs. If medieval Europe were a schoolyard, the Habsburgs were the children who refused to trade lunches with anyone else. They clung to their sandwiches and, over centuries, kept passing the same one back and forth until it got a little moldy. The result was what historians now call the Habsburg jaw. Imagine a chin so long and so prominent it could almost sign documents on its own. This trait became especially noticeable in women of the family. Take, for example, Joanna of Castile, better known as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479, she was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same monarchs, who funded Christopher Columbus, which was itself not their wisest decision. Joanna married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, who was indeed handsome, but also reportedly shallow and unfaithful. Joanna, unfortunately, inherited not only the Habsburg jaw, but also a stew of family-bred mental health issues. She descended into a fog of jealousy, grief, and paranoia, ultimately being confined for decades. Her inbreeding didn't cause her madness in the modern medical sense, but it certainly didn't provide much genetic stability to help her out. Now, Joanna's descendants carried that Habsburg jaw like a family badge of honor, and nowhere did it show more clearly than in Charles II of Spain, born in 1661. He isn't a woman, true, but we need him briefly because his genetics were essentially the family's final examen. He failed spectacularly. His tongue was so large he had trouble eating. His body was weak, his mind confused, and he was, technically, the product of a marriage between an uncle and his niece. But let's step back to the women around him. Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his mother and, in the tangled web of relations, also his father's niece. That made her both mother and cousin to her own son. Try drawing that family tree. It folds in on itself like an origami disaster. Mariana, in portraits, looks solemn, stiff, and draped in dark gowns that suggest she understood her role was more mausoleum caretaker than queen. Her marriage was less a romantic story and more an elaborate chess move that resulted in a sickly heir. Moving north, we find Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was not especially inbred herself, but was part of a dynastic network where cousin marriages were routine. By the time her descendants tangled with the Habsburgs, the gene pool was more of a gene puddle. Her great-great-great-granddaughters in the French royal line sometimes found themselves marrying second cousins, third cousins, or, when the Pope granted special dispensation, closer still. The papacy, by the way, spent centuries untangling this mess. Technically, the Catholic Church forbade marriage within 7 degrees of kinship, but medieval monarchs kept coming back with puppy eyes and political reasons, and popes kept reducing the degrees. By the late Middle Ages, but we're only first cousins was apparently a reasonable plea. Now, if we're talking inbred women of medieval history, we can't ignore the Portuguese line. The House of Aviz tangled with Spanish cousins repeatedly. One notable case was Isabella of Portugal, who married Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, in 1526. She was his first cousin. Isabella is described in records as dignified, pious, and dutiful, which are all polite words meaning she didn't cause too many scandals. But she died relatively young, at 36. Worn out by repeated pregnancies. Many of her children suffered health issues, continuing the dynastic decline. The irony is that many of these women weren't passive victims. They were intelligent, capable, and politically savvy. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, is a perfect example. She was a Spanish princess, deeply inbred like the rest of the Habsburg-connected elite. She had the long jaw, the pale complexion, the tendency toward fragile health. Yet she was also sharp, educated, and resilient. She managed England's affairs while Henry was off fighting, and even led troops at one point. But her repeated stillbirths and miscarriages may have been, at least in part, the unlucky inheritance of that narrow gene pool. Henry, of course, didn't blame inbreeding. He blamed Catherine, which was easier. Let's float briefly back into France, where Louise of Lorraine married Henry III in 1575. Their marriage was cousin-level close, though not the tightest knit on record. Louise was devout and melancholic, described as the White Queen because she favored pale gowns and a ghostly demeanor. She and Henry had no children, likely due to Henry's preferences for male favorites rather than her own health, but Louise faded into history as another royal wife trapped in a dynastic chess match. Some of the saddest examples, though, are the women who carried not only the genetic burden, but also the psychological weight of their dynasties collapsing. Maria Anna of Spain, born in 1606, was another Habsburg princess destined to marry into her own family line. She was originally supposed to marry Charles III of England, which would have been politically useful, but negotiations collapsed. Instead, she married her cousin, Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Their children inherited, predictably, more of the same Habsburg features. Maria Anna spent much of her life as a kind of quiet, dutiful bridge between two sides of the same family tree, producing heirs that looked increasingly identical. It's tempting to laugh at these dynasties for essentially cloning themselves, but for the women inside it, the experience was often isolating and tragic. Many died young from complications of repeated childbirths. Others endured mental illness, treated at the time as either possession or hysteria. And still others watched their children born weak, sickly, or stillborn, while priests assured them it was God's will ignoring the glaring issue of shared grandparents. Perhaps the most famous inbred queen of them all was Margaret of Austria, aunt of Charles V, and later governor of the Netherlands. She was married 3 times, each time to close relatives of her own cousins. Despite fragile health, she proved to be an effective ruler, showing again that inbreeding didn't erase intelligence, it just complicated survival. Portraits show her with the telltale Habsburg features: down-turned mouth, protruding chin, heavy-lidded eyes. She looks weary, as though she knows exactly what her family tree is doing, and disapproves but can't stop it. And then, of course, there is the tragic story of Maria Antonia of Austria, who married her cousin Maximilian II of Bavaria. She suffered lifelong ill health, was described as melancholic, and died young. Another candle snuffed out by the dynasty's refusal to look outside its own mirror. So, who are the most inbred women in medieval history? They were the daughters of dynastic caution. The women married off like parcels, sometimes to their own uncles, sometimes to cousins so close the family gathering must have been awkward. They carried forward both crowns and defects, both titles and tragedies. And the cruel twist is that their sacrifices, their bodies, their health, their sanity, were all in the service of dynasties that eventually crumbled anyway. Spain declined, Austria fractured, France lost its heads. The royal obsession with keeping bloodlines pure turned out to be the most efficient way to make them brittle. When you drift through their portraits today, in dim museum halls, you see the same faces repeating. The same jaw, the same drooping lip, the same weary eyes. Like photocopies fading slightly with each generation. They were queens and princesses. Yes, but also reminders that nature doesn't particularly respect titles. And so, when you read about them, Joanna the Mad, Mariana of Austria, Catherine of Aragon, you're not just reading about royal marriages. You're reading about women who were born into cages built of family pride and papal dispensations. Cages that grew tighter with every cousin marriage approved. Let's drift onward now, leaving behind the pale faces and long jaws of Europe's most determined family. Because inbreeding was one form of royal misfortune. But there were others, quieter and sometimes even more absurd. For example, what happened when kings and queens had children who were too spoiled, too sheltered, or too sickly to ever rule properly? So far tonight, we've wandered through the fading fortunes of royal mistresses, and we've lingered in the dim candlelight of Europe's most inbred princesses. Now let's step into the nursery. Not the cozy kind with pastel wallpaper and lullabies, but the cold, drafty chambers where royal children spent their early years, watched over by anxious nurses, perfumed physicians, and tutors who were more ambitious than affectionate. Royal childhoods weren't exactly fairy tales. If anything, they were more like prolonged medical trials. Many were sickly, almost all were spoiled. And a surprising number were both sad and strangely lonely, despite being surrounded by servants at every hour of the day. So tonight, let's float quietly through the cradles and classrooms of medieval royalty, where fragile heirs sneezed, sulked, and sometimes died before their crowns ever fit. First, the basics. Medieval royal nurseries were not warm places. Castles were drafty, damp, and echoing with the sound of servants clattering. A royal baby might be wrapped in layers of swaddling cloth tight enough to immobilize them completely, like tiny hostages in linen. This, people believed, would ensure straight limbs and proper posture. It also meant the child couldn't move, couldn't explore, and often lay there, staring at ceilings and absorbing whatever diseases drifted in with the servants. Many royal infants didn't survive infancy at all. If you were a medieval queen, you might give birth to 10 children, and perhaps only 3 or 4 lived to adulthood. And those who did survive were often frail. Let's take Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Born in 1537, he was the long-awaited male heir, cherished as proof that God hadn't completely abandoned the Tudor dynasty. But Edward was a fragile child, pale, thin, prone to fevers. His tutors filled his days with Latin, Greek, and scripture, but he spent much of his time coughing into handkerchiefs. He eventually died at the age of 15 after only 6 years on the throne. His childhood was essentially one long preparation for a kingship he never truly enjoyed. Or consider Isabella II of Jerusalem, born in 1212. She inherited the throne as a child, becoming a queen in name while still in swaddling. Her entire life was a series of marriages arranged by others, first betrothed as a child, then passed between husbands like a parcel. She suffered from poor health, constant pregnancies, and died at only 17. Worn out by the burdens of queenship and dynastic expectation. Her childhood was not a time of play or innocence, it was simply a countdown until she was deemed useful for treaties and heirs. And then there were the spoiled children, the kind who had every toy, every treat, every indulgence, because servants were terrified of disappointing them. Charles VI of France later, known as Charles the Madouas, pampered in his youth. He grew up believing himself invincible, adored by courtiers, and indulged in extravagant jousts. But beneath the gilding, his mind unraveled. By adulthood, he was experiencing psychotic episodes, convinced he was made of glass, terrified of breaking. His sad and spoiled childhood did not prepare him for the weight of kingship. The saddest cases are often the royal children raised in isolation for fear of illness. The Dauphin Louis-Joseph, son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, was kept under tight control in Versailles. He suffered from tuberculosis, pale and constantly ill. While his sister played in gardens, Louis coughed in bedchambers, surrounded by doctors who poked and prodded but could not cure him. He died at age 7, another fragile branch broken from a fragile dynasty. Royal childhoods weren't just physically bleak, they were emotionally barren too. Parents were distant, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. Children were raised more by wet nurses and governesses than by their own mothers. A queen might see her child only briefly, handing them back to attendants with instructions to raise them properly. Affection was rare. Duty was constant. Consider Mary, Queen of Scots. Taken from her mother at the age of 5, she was sent to France to be raised at court as a future bride for the French heir. Her childhood was full of riches and tutors, but also displacement. She was a Scottish queen growing up in a French nursery, never truly at home in either place. She learned refinement, yes, but also a constant awareness that her value lay in marriage and diplomacy, not in herself. And then we have the royal children who were spares, not the heir, but the backup plan. These children often lived in a strange limbo. They had luxury without real purpose, titles without real power. Some grew resentful, others simply bored. Richard the Lionheart was a second son, and though he eventually became king, his childhood was shaped by the knowledge that his older brother was the favored heir. He grew up restless, martial, determined to seize glory because he was denied certainty. Illness was nearly constant. Royal physicians prescribed remedies that often made things worse. A child with fever might be bled, leeched, or dosed with mercury-based medicines. Headaches were treated with crushed emeralds, indigestion with ground pearls. Childhood in a royal nursery wasn't a golden escape from danger, it was a daily negotiation with quackery. Henry VI of England grew up shielded, bookish, and sickly. His tutors praised his piety but worried about his fragility. By adulthood, he suffered bouts of catatonic withdrawal, unable to rule. His sad childhood, full of prayers and silences, left him unprepared for the wars of the roses that engulfed his kingdom. Sometimes being spoiled was just as harmful. Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King, was indulged relentlessly as a boy. His tutors called him God-given, and courtiers bowed to him in nursery halls. He grew up with an unshakable sense of his own magnificence, which translated into decades of absolute rule. It worked for him, but his childhood set the stage for a kingdom that revolved around one man's whims, hardly a sustainable model. One of the strangest cases is Ivan Thafur of Russia later, Ivan the Terrible. As a boy, Ivan lived in the Kremlin but was largely ignored. Servants neglected him, nobles bullied him, and he developed a taste for cruelty by throwing animals from towers for entertainment. His sad and violent childhood blossomed into a reign of terror. His paranoia, brutality, and relentless suspicion of everyone around him were rooted in those lonely, neglected years. Even in milder cases, royal children often felt like prisoners of their own nurseries. They were constantly watched, constantly taught, constantly reminded of their importance. Free play was rare. Friendships were discouraged if they might encourage over familiarity. The result? Adults who were emotionally stunted, sometimes incapable of trust or affection. Catherine de' Medici's children, for example, grew up in the poisonous atmosphere of the French court. Surrounded by intrigue, sickly from constant outbreaks of plague, and pressured to marry advantageously, they grew into troubled adults. Her son, Charles IX, suffered from violent fits of rage and paranoia, traits that may have been nurtured by a childhood steeped in suspicion. So sickly, spoiled, and sad that sums up most royal childhoods. They had wealth, yes. Gilded cradles, embroidered gowns, servants to carry them from one cold chamber to another. But beneath the velvet was fragility. Beneath the crowns, constant illness. And behind the jewels, loneliness. It's easy to envy royalty when you look at the paintings. Chubby-cheeked children in silk, holding golden toys. But if you look closer, you see the shadows under their eyes, the awkward posture of children swaddled too long, the faint suggestion that they've already been burdened with a life they didn't choose. And as we drift away from their nurseries, let's remember this. Royal childhood wasn't a golden escape from reality. It was reality, sharpened by politics and dulled by isolation. For every prince or princess who thrived, there were many who wasted away, coddled into uselessness or neglected into paranoia. So, when you hear about a mighty king or a tragic queen, pause for a moment and picture them as children, lying in cold nurseries, swaddled tight, coughing into handkerchiefs or staring out castle windows. Sickly, spoiled, and sad long before the crown ever touched their heads. Let's drift gently onward now, into another corner of royal absurdity. Because if royal children were fragile, what about the decisions their parents made? What about the times kings and queens, in all their wisdom, managed to make choices so misguided that even their courtiers winced? We've wandered through royal mistresses, inbred princesses, and pale, coughing children. Now it's time to step into the throne room itself, where kings and queens, those supposed pinnacles of wisdom, made decisions so baffling, so short-sighted, that even their most sycophantic courtiers must have raised an eyebrow. Royalty had immense power. They could raise taxes, start wars, end wars, marry whole countries together, and yet, time and again, they managed to take all that power and direct it into catastrophes that solved nothing, changed nothing, and occasionally made their lives much worse. Tonight, let's glide through some of these grand blunders. Not the dramatic ones, the world-shaken conquests, but the smaller, pettier missteps. The ones that left everyone sighing into their goblets and muttering, "Really, that was your plan." Let's begin with King John of England, the man responsible for the Magna Carta, though not because he wanted to be. John reigned from 1199 to 1216 and had an uncanny talent for alienating everyone around him. Nobles, clergy, even his own family. His biggest misstep? Taxing his barons into fury, then losing their loyalty by managing wars so badly that he gave away more French land than he kept. The result, a rebellion that forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. John probably thought it was just another annoying document, one he could wriggle out of later. Instead, it became the cornerstone of English law. A decision meant to quiet a revolt became the document that forever limited royal authority. For John, a complete failure. For history, mildly convenient. Then there was Charles VI of France, already mentioned in his fragile childhood, but worth revisiting for his adult brilliance. Known as Charles the Mad, he once decided he was made of glass, and insisted his courtiers handle him carefully lest he shatter. Not ideal for running a kingdom. One of his more practical missteps came during the 100 Years' War. Charles signed the Treaty of Troy in 1420, disinheriting his own son and naming Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. A decision that effectively said, "Yes, please take half my kingdom. I'm tired." His son, the future Charles VII, was understandably displeased. The French crown nearly slipped permanently into English hands, until, inconveniently for England, Henry V died young. Charles's misguided decision solved nothing and deepened the war. If we wander eastward, we find the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XV in the 15th century. Facing the rising Ottoman Empire, he had one job: defend Constantinople. Instead, he spent precious time and resources arguing over church doctrine, trying to reunite the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Noble in theory, pointless in practice. By the time the Ottomans breached the city walls in 1453, the theological paperwork was very neatly in order, but the empire itself was gone. Then there's poor Mary, Queen of Scots. She had a gift for misguided decisions. Marrying Lord Darnley, who turned out to be vain, violent, and possibly murderous. Aligning with factions that betrayed her. Fleeing to England to seek refuge with her cousin Elizabeth I, who promptly locked her up for 19 years. Mary's decisions didn't secure her throne. They secured her execution. Her head rolled in 1587, and her son, James VI of Scotland, quietly inherited both crowns anyway. All that scheming, all that misery, and in the end, things sorted themselves out without her. Spain offers us the delightfully misguided Philip II. He decided that sending an enormous fleet, the Armadain 1588, would solve his English problem. His English problem being, of course, that Elizabeth I existed. The Armada was a masterpiece of overconfidence, huge, slow, badly supplied. English fire ships scattered it, storms destroyed it, and Philip gained nothing but a reputation for hubris. Spain remained powerful for a while, but that decision marked the slow unraveling of its dominance. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had one of her best PR moments, delivering speeches in armor while comparing herself to a lion. Let's drift north to Sweden, where King Erik XIV reigned briefly in the 1560s. Erik was intelligent but paranoid, convinced his nobles were plotting against him. One day, in a fit of rage, he personally stabbed one of them to death, Niels Sture, during what was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting. This wasn't exactly a savvy political move. His nobles promptly revolted, deposed him, and locked him in a castle. He died a decade later, probably poisoned with a bowl of pea soup. A king who decided that murder was a good diplomatic tactic, only to discover it rarely is. Royal finances were another favorite playground for bad decisions. Take Louis XVI of France. Facing a kingdom drowning in debt, he had the bright idea to summon the Estates General in 1789, hoping for new taxes. Instead, he accidentally triggered the French Revolution. Within a few years, he lost not just his throne, but his head. His decision to cling to traditional privileges rather than reform solved nothing and made everything worse. We should also mention the Holy Roman Emperors, who had a special knack for indecision masquerading as decision. Sigismund, for example, presided over the Council of Constance in 1415. The goal was to end the Western Schism when 3 rival popes claimed authority. Sigismund's approach was to support one pope, then another, until eventually all 3 were deposed. The schism ended, yes, but Sigismund himself looked like a man who couldn't order a meal without changing it 3 times. Sometimes misguided decisions were gloriously petty. King James II of England, for instance, spent much of his short reign alienating people by promoting Catholics to prominent positions. Not inherently bad, but deeply unpopular in Protestant England. His insistence on doing so in the face of mounting opposition drove even his supporters to abandon him. He fled into exile during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, making him perhaps the only king in history to lose a throne simply by being stubborn about job appointments. And then we have Empress Matilda in the 12th century, daughter of Henry IV of England. Her father named her heir, but when he died, her cousin Stephen claimed the throne. Matilda's decision: march into England, demand recognition, and then alienate everyone with her imperious behavior. At one point, she entered London in triumph, only to be chased out again within days because she refused to compromise. She never secured the throne, though her son eventually became Henry II. Her decisions didn't make her queen. They just prolonged a civil war, known somewhat poetically as the Anarchy. Even the mighty Charlemagne wasn't immune. In 806, he divided his empire among his 3 sons. Sensible, he thought. Except one son died, then another, leaving Louis the Pious with everything and none of the administrative support. Louis then repeated the mistake, dividing the empire again among his sons, leading to decades of fraternal conflict and the eventual disintegration of the Carolingian Empire. A royal family tradition create instability through inheritance planning, then act surprised when it doesn't work. Sometimes misguided decisions were almost charming in their futility. Take Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia. His reign was plagued with unrest, and his response was to go hunting, constantly. While Prague simmered with rebellion, Wenceslaus was in the forest, chasing deer. His courtiers eventually locked him up, proving that sometimes indecision is as fatal as bad decision. What all these stories show is that being royal didn't guarantee wisdom. In fact, it often encouraged the opposite. Surrounded by flatterers, rarely contradicted, pampered from childhoods, it's no wonder so many kings and queens made choices that left their kingdoms weaker, their subjects angrier, and their reputations tattered. From John losing Normandy, to Mary losing her head, to Philip losing an entire fleet, the pattern is steady. Royalty made decisions with absolute confidence, and then watched as reality refused to cooperate. So, what happened when kings and queens made misguided decisions? Usually, nothing good. Sometimes their thrones toppled, sometimes their children paid the price, and sometimes history quietly moved on, leaving them as footnotes under what not to do. As we drift onward, let's leave behind the grand blunders of misguided rulers. Next, we'll settle into something a little quieter but no less absurd: the strange habits and petty meltdowns of monarchs. Because when kings and queens weren't ruining nations, they were often busy sulking, feuding, or collecting oddities, reminding us that, at the end of the day, royal blood didn't make you less ridiculous. We've drifted past mistresses, inbred princesses, coughing royal children, and kings who made bafflingly bad decisions. But there's another side to monarchy that's less about politics and more about personality. Because kings and queens were still human beings, and humans, when given limitless wealth, unquestioned power, and too much free time, tend to develop habits that make everyone else quietly uncomfortable. Some monarchs collected oddities. Some refused to bathe. Some screamed over trivial slights. And others had meltdowns so public that even their most loyal courtiers winced, smiled politely, and probably whispered jokes about it later. So tonight, let's stroll quietly through a gallery of royal quirks, strange habits, petty tantrums, and the sort of behavior that proves crowns don't make you dignified. Let's begin with Peter the Great of Russia. Peter was, without exaggeration, obsessed with teeth. Not just his own, everyone's. He carried dental tools wherever he went, and had the unnerving habit of yanking out people's teeth, often without asking. If you were at Peter's court and mentioned even the faintest toothache, you might end up leaving with fewer teeth than you arrived with. He collected them in a pouch, like a macabre coin purse. For Peter, it was a hobby. For everyone else, it was dental terrorism. Meanwhile, in Spain, Philip II was fond of paperwork. Fond is putting it mildly. He was notorious for spending endless hours locked in his study, writing notes on the margins of reports, correcting trivial details, and delaying decisions for months over misplaced commas. Imagine a monarch with the soul of an obsessive clerk. His empire stretched across continents, yet Philip managed to drown it in ink. He micromanaged so relentlessly that even urgent wars slowed to a crawl. His strange habit wasn't dramatic, it was bureaucracy weaponized. Louis XIV, a Franks the Soon king, was another case. His strange habit wasn't teeth or paperwork. It was his daily routine, elevated into sacred theater. Every morning, courtiers were summoned to watch him wake up, sit up, and get dressed. It was called the lever. Every evening they watched him undress, known as the coucher. Courtiers jostled for the honor of handing the king his stockings or his shirt, or even the basin of water for his face. Louis turned his private habits into state ceremonies. For him, it was power. For everyone else, it was the most awkward slumber party in history. And then there's Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles had a peculiar devotion to eels. He loved eating them, despite the fact that his doctors warned him constantly they worsened his gout. He ate them anyway, habitually, as though daring his body to rebel. It did. His health collapsed under waves of gout attacks, leaving him bedridden for much of his later life. Yet still he demanded eels, as though royal willpower could override biology. It couldn't. Moving north again, let's look at Queen Christina of Sweden in the 17th century. Christina had a habit of baffling everyone around her. She dressed in men's clothes, refused to marry, and enjoyed shocking courtiers with her disregard for convention. Her petty meltdowns were often staged. She once dismissed a servant in the middle of a banquet simply for chewing too loudly. She also ordered the assassination of her rival Monaldeschi while in France, turning a quiet diplomatic trip into an opera of scandal. Christina's habits weren't merely eccentric, they made her court feel like an unpredictable theater. Royal meltdowns often revolved around food. King James IV of England had a habit of lecturing courtiers about table manners while eating so sloppily that food dribbled down his beard. He once threw a tantrum because a servant handed him a napkin folded the wrong way. His court learned quickly. Presentation mattered more than content. If the napkin was wrong, the king was wronged. Then there's Ferdinand of Thorn of Austria, a 19th century monarch but in the same eccentric tradition. Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy and various developmental disabilities, products of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. He had a simple but persistent habit: demanding dumplings. One famous line attributed to him came during a peasant revolt. His generals explained they couldn't both fight and give him dumplings. Ferdinand reportedly replied, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." His reign was more or less directed by regents, but his strange culinary fixation lives on in historical memory. Let's not forget Elizabeth I of England. Brilliant politically, yes, but personally she was intensely vain. Her strange habit was painting her face with white lead makeup layer after layer to maintain her mask of youth. Over time, the makeup corroded her skin, leaving her more scarred beneath the paint. But Elizabeth clung to the ritual. She also flew into rages when courtiers hinted at her aging. More than once, she threw shoes at servants for mentioning wrinkles. The Virgin Queen had many strengths, but handling the passage of time gracefully was not one of them. Sometimes the habits were religious in nature. Charles IX of France was known to engage in compulsive hunting. He would ride for days, chasing animals endlessly, as though physical exertion could drown out the political chaos around him. His meltdowns often came when he was forced to stop. He sulked, raged, and accused courtiers of conspiring to keep him from his passion. For Charles, the hunt was sanity. Without it, he unraveled. One of the more pitiable habits belonged to George III of England. Famous for his bouts of madness, George developed a habit of writing endless, rambling letters to himself and to his ministers, sometimes dozens in a single day. His meltdowns included shouting matches with empty rooms and long monologues directed at furniture. Courtiers tried to pretend it was normal. It wasn't. But in the quiet moments, George's habit of writing page after page of nonsense reveals a man struggling to order a mind that refused to obey. On the pettier end of things, Frederick William III of Prussia had a habit of personally inspecting his soldiers' height. He adored tall men and created the infamous Potsdam Giants, a regiment of unusually tall soldiers. He collected them obsessively, even arranging marriages between them to breed taller offspring. When his courtiers presented shorter soldiers, he flew into meltdowns, shouting, stamping, and threatening dismissal. For Frederick William, height was power. For everyone else, it was a very strange recruitment policy. Let's also drift briefly back to Russia, to Tsar Paul I. Paul had a habit of rewriting military uniforms constantly. One day it was this color, the next day another cut, then a new hat design. Soldiers despaired of keeping up. Paul would stage surprise inspections and explode with fury if the tiniest detail was wrong. His obsession with buttons, plumes, and epaulets became legendary. He reigned only a few years before being assassinated by his own officers, perhaps out of exhaustion from constant wardrobe updates. And then, of course, there was Napoleon Bonaparte. Not technically a monarch by birth, but crowned emperor nonetheless. Napoleon had the habit of dictating letters deep into the night, sometimes dozens in one sitting. He micromanaged everything, down to troop rations and uniform stitches. His meltdowns were famous, shouting, pacing, throwing objects at ministers who displeased him. Yet, curiously, after his fits, he would calm instantly as if nothing had happened. His courtiers learned to wait patiently, nodding until the storm passed. The pattern across all these monarchs is clear. With absolute power came absolute indulgence of quirks. Courtiers couldn't say no. Servants couldn't complain. If a king wanted dumplings during a revolt, dumplings must be found. If a queen wanted her wrinkles painted away with poison, her ladies obliged. If an emperor wanted taller soldiers, marriages were arranged. And when frustrations boiled over, when monarchs screamed over napkins, shoes, uniforms, or servants chewing too loudly, everyone else simply endured it. Because the crown was fragile, but the tantrum was immediate. So, what do these habits and meltdowns tell us? That beneath the jewels, monarchs were still deeply human, prone to vanity, obsession, paranoia, or boredom. The only difference was scale. Where ordinary people had quirks, kings had courts forced to watch, applaud, and sometimes participate. As we drift out of their private chambers and back into the candle-lit hallways, let's remember, crowns didn't make people less ridiculous. They just made their ridiculousness harder to ignore. And with that, let's continue onward to the quieter corners of royal life once more. Because sometimes the strangest details aren't the tantrums or the obsessions, but the little contradictions. The way monarchs tried to be both symbols and people, saints and sinners, rulers and prisoners of their own crowns. We've wandered through mistresses, dynastic inbreeding, fragile children, terrible decisions, and petty tantrums. Now let's look at something softer, but no less curious, the contradictions that defined monarchs. Because kings and queens didn't just play roles, they performed them. By day, they were paragons of faith, justice, and dignity. By night or simply behind closed doors, they were often quite different. Pious in church, greedy at the treasury, chaste in sermons, indulgent in bedrooms, merciful in proclamations, furious in private. This tension between the image and the reality is what made monarchy such a long-running performance art. And tonight, we'll let ourselves drift gently through some of the best examples. Let's begin with Louis Sign of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. Publicly, he was the very model of a Christian king. He attended multiple masses a day, wore simple clothes beneath his royal robes, and was known for washing the feet of the poor. He led 2 crusades, convinced he was serving God. Privately, though, Louis was a man of contradictions. He condemned gambling, but enjoyed expensive entertainments. He denounced vanity, but presided over one of the most glittering courts in Europe. And though he was saintly in the public, he was also rigid and sometimes harsh with his own children, demanding obedience that went far beyond piety. He may have been canonized, but he was still a king with moods, and his temper at home rarely made it into the hagiographies. Moving forward a few centuries, we find Henry VIII of England. Henry loved to present himself as defender of the faith, the great Catholic king of Europe. Early in his reign, he even published a theological work against Martin Luther, earning praise from the Pope. Publicly, he was the loyal son of the Church. Privately, he was already scheming to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, already restless with mistresses, already cultivating the contradictions that would eventually rip England out of Catholic Europe altogether. He went from faithful son to excommunicated tyrant, but he managed to keep the performance going for years before the mask slipped. Mary Tudor Bloody Mary offers another example. Publicly, she styled herself as the restorer of Catholic faith in England, a queen determined to heal the schism. She paraded her devotion, her loyalty to Rome, her sense of divine mission. Privately, she was haunted by deep insecurity and loneliness. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was a cold political match. Her phantom pregnancies left her humiliated, and her temper grew brittle. The contradiction was stark. In public, she was the hammer of heresy. In private, she was a woman who cried often, praying desperately for a child that never came. Elizabeth Thavars, her half-sister, took contradictions to an art form. Publicly, she was the Virgin Queen, devoted to her country, untouchable, almost saint-like in her independence. She wore white lead makeup and elaborate gowns to maintain the illusion of eternal youth. Privately, she was prone to fits of jealousy, particularly toward younger women at court. She raged against ladies-in-waiting who dared to marry without her permission, and she threw shoes, worse, when reminded of her aging. Her virginity was a performance carefully maintained, while her actual relationships remained murky. The contradiction was her greatest strength. By playing the saint in public and the shrew in private, she kept everyone guessing. Then there was Philip the Fair of France. Publicly, he was known for his stern dignity, his sense of justice, and his unyielding faith. He even crushed the Knights Templar, accusing them of heresy, which conveniently transferred much of their wealth to his treasury. Privately, Philip was calculating to the point of paranoia. He manipulated marriages, fabricated charges, and schemed endlessly to keep his dynasty secure. His justice was not blind, it was deeply self-interested. He was both saintly reformer and ruthless accountant, sometimes within the same hour. One of the most striking contradictions came from Ferdinand II of Aragon, husband of Isabella. Publicly, Ferdinand and Isabella were the Catholic monarchs, uniting Spain under the banner of Christianity. They expelled the Jews, launched the Inquisition, and funded Columbus in the name of spreading the faith. Privately, Ferdinand was far less devout. He kept mistresses, maneuvered politically with Machiavellian calculation, and treated faith more as a useful tool than a guiding light. Isabella was genuinely pious. Ferdinand was pragmatically pious. Together, they created the illusion of pure devotion. In reality, one half of the pair was very much a sinner with good timing. Drifting further east, we meet Ivan the Terrible again. Publicly, Ivan presented himself as the protector of orthodoxy, the defender of the Russian people, chosen by God. His speeches were full of holy fire and divine mission. Privately, he was consumed by paranoia, cruelty, and fits of rage. He murdered his own son in one such fit, an act of violence that shattered his family. He alternated between prayer and torture, building churches one day and ordering massacres the next. To his subjects, he was both saint and monster, sometimes in the same week. France offers us yet another contradiction in Louis XV. Publicly, he was the beloved, adored as a gracious, charming king. He staged elaborate court rituals, sponsored the arts, and cultivated the image of elegance. Privately, he was notorious for his endless string of mistresses, his secret parc serre, where young women were housed for his pleasure, and his increasing disinterest in ruling at all. By the end of his reign, the contradiction had collapsed. The beloved had become the despised, and his public saintliness was forgotten. Sometimes the contradiction was less moral and more practical. Charles VI of England, for instance, styled himself as a king of divine right, above earthly squabbles, calm and dignified in portraits. In private, he was indecisive, anxious, and dependent on advisers he mistrusted. His contradictions weakened his authority, and when civil war came, the illusion shattered. Even in the Byzantine Empire, emperors leaned into contradiction. Basil VI, known as the Bulgar Slayer, was publicly austere, celibate, and devoted to military discipline. He presented himself as a monk king, holy and severe. Privately, he had a taste for brutal cruelty, blinding thousands of prisoners after victories, an act that had little to do with holiness and everything to do with terror. He lived like a saint, but punished like a demon. The pattern repeats across centuries. Monarchs had to be two things at once: saints in public, sinners in private. Their crowns demanded dignity, while their humanity demanded release. Some handled it with charm, like Elizabeth I. Some with cruelty, like Ivan. Some collapsed under the strain, like Mary Tudor. And perhaps that's why royal history feels both glamorous and tragic. Because these contradictions weren't just personal, they were political. A monarch's public image was a shield. Their private sins were cracks in the armor. When the cracks grew too large, revolutions, assassinations, or humiliations often followed. So as we drift away from their candlelit chapels and their shadowy bedchambers, let's remember this: monarchy was theater. The costumes were velvet, the crowns were gold, the lines were written by priests and poets, but behind the curtain were people. Flawed, petty, insecure, indulgent, sometimes cruel. Saints in public, sinners in private, just as human as the rest of us, only with better jewelry. Let's keep wandering. Because while contradictions shape their images, there are other elements that shape their downfall. things not even their crowns could protect them from: illness, weakness, and the slow, inevitable decline of their bodies under the weight of all that inbreeding, indulgence, and stress. So far, we've seen mistresses fading, dynasties folding in on themselves, royal children coughing into silk handkerchiefs, and monarchs screaming about napkins. But no matter how glittering their crowns or how indulgent their tantrums, kings and queens all face the same destination: decline. The long, slow unraveling of bodies that had once been treated as nearly divine. Royal illness was different from ordinary illness, at least in appearance. For ordinary people, sickness meant work stopped, food thinned, and family worried. For monarchs, sickness meant endless physicians crowding chambers, priests hovering with holy water, courtiers whispering in corridors, and everyone pretending the ruler was still in command, while the ruler was, in fact, groaning in bed. Let's wander softly into these royal deathbeds, because they reveal not only human fragility, but the peculiar way monarchy clung to dignity even as its bodies collapsed. First, let's visit Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. Born in 1661, he was the culmination of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. His body was a patchwork of ailments. He had trouble eating, trouble speaking, trouble reproducing, essentially trouble existing. Portraits show him with that famous long Habsburg jaw, eyes heavy and tired, lips drooping as though gravity was just stronger in his family. His decline was slow, painful, and observed by half of Europe, since everyone was waiting to see who would inherit Spain. Charles suffered seizures, digestive issues, and bizarre episodes that baffled his physicians. They tried everything: bloodletting, potions, exorcisms, pilgrimages. None worked. By his 30s, he looked decades older, a ghost in royal clothing. When he died in 1700 at age 38, an autopsy revealed a body described as without a single healthy organ. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his head fully fluid, his intestines rotted. He had lived and died as a monument to dynastic stubbornness. His decline wasn't just personal, it was the collapse of Spain's dynasty itself. Henry VIII of England offers another grim example. Early in life, Henry was athletic, broad-shouldered, and admired. By the end, he was a swollen shadow. Years of feasting, wine, and indulgence combined with leg ulcers that refused to heal. The ulcers oozed constantly, and the smell was reportedly unbearable. He grew obese, unable to walk without mechanical assistance. Courtiers constructed a system of pulleys to haul him upstairs, like a sack of potatoes in velvet. Henry raged more as his body failed him. His paranoia deepened, his tempers shortened, and his marriages ended with more blood than affection. By the time he died in 1547, his once magnificent body was so distended that his coffin reportedly burst, leaking fluids into the church. A less than dignified ending for a man obsessed with grandeur. Louis XIV, of France's son, king reigned for 72 years, longer than most people even lived in his time. His decline was equally long. By his 70s, Louis was suffering from constant pain, gout, and, finally, gangrene in his leg. The infection blackened his flesh, and physicians argued endlessly about whether to amputate. They didn't. Louis endured weeks of agony, attended by courtiers who still had to go through the motions of bowing, addressing him as if he were radiant, while he lay sweating, his once golden aura collapsing into decay. He insisted on performing his role until the very end, attending councils even while feverish. When he finally died in 1715, courtiers sighed in relief, not only for his soul, but because his endless decline had exhausted everyone. George III of England provides another kind of slow death, mental rather than physical. Known as Mad King George, he experienced repeated bouts of mental illness, possibly porphyria, possibly bipolar disorder. His decline stretched over decades. At times he rambled incoherently, spoke to trees, and wrote hundreds of nonsensical letters. During episodes, he foamed at the mouth, sang endlessly, or shouted for hours. His court watched in quiet horror, trying to maintain the fiction of stability. His illness wasn't a single collapse. It was a long series of public unravelings, punctuated by brief returns to lucidity. He died in 1820, blind, deaf, and insane. A man who had once ruled an empire reduced to a patient in permanent confinement. Not all declines were drawn out. Some monarchs simply toppled. Edward VI, mentioned earlier, died at 15 after a short, brutal illness, probably tuberculosis. But even here, the decline was dramatized. Physicians tried desperate remedies, bleeding, purges, and strange concoctions. He grew weaker, thinner, and finally slipped away, his glorious childhood ending in a slow suffocation. Others faced illnesses that today would be minor. Queen Anne of England endured endless pregnancies, 17, most ending in stillbirths or miscarriages. By her later years, she was swollen with gout, unable to walk, carried from room to room in chairs. Her body was worn down not just by illness, but by the expectations of dynasty. She died in 1714, childless, the last of the Stuarts. Her decline was a quiet tragedy, not dramatic, but a steady extinguishing of hope with each lost child. Royal illness often attracted bizarre treatments. Physicians believed kings and queens required stronger remedies than commoners. So they prescribed gold dust, crushed pearls, bezoar stones from animal stomachs, or most popular of all, mercury. Monarchs were slowly poisoned in the name of healing. Catherine de' Medici, though not a monarch herself but a queen consort, suffered endless illnesses, treated with concoctions that likely worsened her condition. Charles II of England, the merry monarch, not to be confused with the tragic Spanish Charles II, was treated for kidney disease with skull moss scraped from churchyard bones. Unsurprisingly, it didn't help. The final days of monarchs were always theatrical. Beds surrounded by courtiers, priests reciting prayers, heirs waiting impatiently nearby. Death was public, even intimate details observed by dozens. Take Francis I of France. Once a Renaissance prince, tall and strong, by the end he was covered in boils, barely able to move, gasping for air. Courtiers crowded around his bed, pretending to admire his piety while secretly calculating their next moves. Francis, once a figure of chivalry, died in 1547, groaning under the weight of infection. Or Charles IX of France, who coughed up blood, weakened by tuberculosis, while haunted by guilt over the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. His decline was not only physical, but psychological, plagued by nightmares of the thousands killed under his orders. The strange thing is how death seemed to flatten monarchs. No matter how grand their lives, their ends were grimly ordinary. Pain, infection, exhaustion, bodies swelling, shrinking, or rotting. Physicians fussed, priests prayed, but the outcome was the same. Perhaps the only difference was that their suffering was watched, recorded, and later painted as dignified. Portraits show serene deathbeds. In reality, there was sweat, screams, smells, and frantic whispers. So what do these slow declines tell us? That monarchy couldn't insulate anyone from mortality. Charles II of Spain with his failing body, Henry VIII bursting his coffin, Louis XIV's rotting leg, George III's madness, a reminder that crowns don't stop time. And maybe that's why royal deaths fascinated their subjects, because they revealed the ultimate contradiction. Monarchs were dressed as semi-divine, but they died like everyone else, in pain, in fear, sometimes in absurdity. As we drift away from their deathbeds, let's step into a quieter shadow, because not every royal was famous, not every crown glittered brightly. Some princes, princesses, and cousins lived entire lives in obscurity, forgotten by history, remembered only as footnotes. And perhaps their quietness was the strangest fate of all. We've drifted past mistresses, inbred princesses, spoiled children, misguided rulers, eccentric meltdowns, and deathbeds. But not every royal had a dramatic story. In fact, most didn't. For every Henry VIII or Louis XIV, there were dozens of siblings, cousins, and spares who floated quietly through history, present, technically royal, but ultimately unimportant. They were married off to minor dukes, shuffled into convents, or simply left in the background, their portraits gathering dust. Tonight, let's wander through these forgotten lives, because sometimes obscurity was stranger than fame. Let's start with the concept of the spare. Every dynasty needed heirs, but heirs had a distressing habit of dying. So parents produced backups, second sons, third sons, and endless daughters, all waiting just in case. Most never ascended. Instead, they hovered on the edges of power. Some became loyal brothers, others bitter rivals, and many simply faded. Take, for example, Princess Mary of England, daughter of Henry VIII, and Catherine of Aragon. Not Mary Tudor, the queen who burned Protestants, that Mary. This was Mary's half-sister, one of Henry's other daughters. She lived quietly, overshadowed by the dynastic chaos around her. She had no throne, no great role. Just a life of dutiful obedience, remembered today only as the other Mary. In France, forgotten royals often ended up in convents. Spare daughters were bundled off with dowries and vows, becoming abbesses rather than queens. Marguerite of Valois-Better, known as Queen Margot, had sisters who spent their entire lives in cloisters, occasionally mentioned in letters, otherwise invisible. It was a tidy solution, fewer marriage alliances to negotiate, and fewer daughters cluttering the royal nursery. For the daughters themselves, it meant lives of prayer, embroidery, and slow anonymity. They were technically royal, but also technically irrelevant. Their crowns were metaphorical, their power non-existent. Spain, with its endless Habsburg line, was especially full of sideline siblings. Many of Charles V's daughters became nuns. His daughter, Maria of Austria, for example, spent her life in Madrid, managing convent affairs, remembered as pious but politically meaningless. In portraits, these women look solemn, swaddled in dark habits, faces pale against the black veils. The weight of dynasty pressed down on them not through crowns, but through obscurity. Forgotten royals who lived and died in cloisters, their only legacy prayers whispered into stone walls. Sons had their own version of this fate. Second sons often received minor titles, duchies or bishoprics. Some lived comfortably, others restlessly. Consider Prince George of Denmark, husband of Queen Anne of England. Technically royal, technically important, but remembered mostly for being unremarkable. His contemporaries joked that his greatest accomplishment was staying out of the way. When he died, even his wife, who did love him, reportedly said, "He was never of great consequence." A damningly faint epitaph. The Stuart dynasty in Britain produced a whole litter of forgotten children. James II had daughters who married into minor German houses, disappearing into provincial courts. They hosted small balls, managed estates, and lived lives so undramatic they barely merit a line in history books. Yet they were royal, with portraits painted, titles held, and lives that simply slipped by. The Holy Roman Empire excelled at manufacturing forgotten royals. With so many principalities, dukedoms, and archduchies, there were endless archduchesses and princes with impressive names but no impact. Archduchess Maria Anna here, Archduke Leopold there married off, producing heirs, vanishing into genealogical charts. One such woman, Archduchess Magdalena of Austria, founded a convent in Innsbruck and then spent the rest of her life in pious obscurity. Another, Archduchess Eleanor, married a duke, became a widow, and lived quietly on his estates. No scandals, no wars, just decades of forgotten dinners and seasonal festivals. Sometimes being forgotten was preferable. The younger sons of the French Bourbons lived through the Revolution precisely because they weren't important enough to execute immediately. They drifted into exile, shuffled between minor courts in Germany and Italy, living on pensions, their names barely recognized. Others weren't so lucky. The Russian Romanovs produced many spares who were forgotten in life but executed in death, swept up in the 1918 purges. Nicholas II's daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia were royal but politically irrelevant. Yet their obscurity didn't save them. Their story is remembered only because of its violent end. One of the strangest fates belonged to Princess Wilhelmina of Prussia, sister of Frederick the Great. She was bright, witty, and cultured, but married off to a minor margrave in Bayreuth. There, she built a small but elegant court, wrote memoirs, and tried to matter. Yet in the grand sweep of history, she is overshadowed by her brother. Wilhelmine was royal, intelligent, and ambitious, but destined to be a footnote, remembered mostly by specialists and locals. The saddest forgotten royals were often children who died young. The endless lists of Prince Edward, who lived 2 years, Princess Margaret, dead at 3 months, fill royal genealogies. For their parents, tragedies. For history, barely a line. Yet each of those small lives was once a dynastic hope, wrapped in silk, baptized with ceremony, and then buried quietly in tiny coffins. So, what did it mean to be a forgotten royal? It meant being technically important, but practically invisible. Wearing crowns in portraits, but not in reality. Living in castles, but never shaping kingdoms. And perhaps, in a way, it was a gentler fate. Better to spend a life in embroidery and minor estates than to be guillotined, assassinated, or remembered for madness. Obscurity may have been dull, but it was often safer. As we drift away from these shadowy figures, abbesses, minor dukes, spare sons, forgotten daughters, we're left with a curious thought. Most royals weren't Henrys or Elizabeths. They weren't remembered in statues or revolutions. They were just people born into crowns that never fit, living quietly, and then vanishing. Let's move onward now to the last theme. Because if forgotten royals tried to fade, others fought desperately to be remembered. They built palaces, monuments, tombs, and portraits to keep their names alive. And in doing so, They revealed the vanity of legacy, the desperate attempt to outlast mortality with stone and paint. For all their power, monarchs shared the same quiet fear as the rest of us: being forgotten. The difference is, they had far more resources to fight against it. Where ordinary people left behind a gravestone or perhaps a family tale, kings and queens built palaces, carved tombs, and commissioned portraits designed to last forever. Some succeeded. Versailles still dazzles. Elizabeth Thummower still peers out from her mask of youth. Catherine the Great still stands proudly in bronze. Others failed, their statues crumbled, their palaces rotted, their names remembered only as footnotes. Tonight, let's stroll gently through these legacies, how monarchs tried to outwit time, and how often time had the last laugh. First, the obvious: palaces. Nothing says "please remember me" like several acres of stone, gilded ceilings, and a garden big enough to lose your peasants in. Louis XIV mastered this with Versailles. What had been a modest hunting lodge became a sprawling palace of mirrors, fountains, and endless corridors. It wasn't just a home, it was propaganda in stone. Versailles said, "I am eternal. My dynasty is eternal. The sun itself rises and sets by me." It worked in a way. People still visit Versailles today, marveling at its grandeur. The irony, of course, is that Louis's great-grandson lost it all in the French Revolution. Versailles survived. The monarchy did not. Legacy, yes. Dynasty, no. Elizabeth took a different approach. She built her legacy in paint and pageantry. Portraits of Elizabeth were tightly controlled, no casual sketches allowed. Her image was edited before Photoshop existed. Wrinkles vanished, youth was eternal, and symbolism filled every frame. Pearls for purity, suns for radiance, hands on globes for power. The result, the mask of youth, as it's called, endures. Elizabeth died aged 69, toothless, wigged and scarred by makeup, but the portraits never admitted it. The Virgin Queen still stares down at us from walls, ageless, untouchable, remembered exactly as she wanted. Legacy preserved at the cost of reality. Catherine the Great of Russia left monuments of a different kind. She expanded the empire, modernized administration, and built statues of herself as Minerva, goddess of wisdom. One particularly large statue in St. Petersburg shows her holding a scroll, surrounded by famous statesmen who, awkwardly, were mostly people she had outmaneuvered or sidelined. Catherine curated her legacy in stone, reminding Russia and the world, "I was not just a woman on the throne, I was the throne itself." It worked. Even today, her name is spoken with grandeur, despite whispers about her personal life. The statues stand taller than the rumors. In Spain, Philip II tried to leave his mark with El Escorial, a vast monastery palace complex. Severe, grey and imposing, it was less "look at my glory" and more "fear my piety." Visitors today admire its size but often remark on its gloom. Philip's legacy was stone walls and silence, a reflection of his personality. Memorable, yes, but hardly warm. Some monarchs obsessed over their tombs. Richard II of England commissioned an elaborate double effigy tomb at Westminster Abbey, showing himself and his queen side by side. The tomb is magnificent. The irony? Richard was deposed, imprisoned, and likely murdered. His body was dumped unceremoniously in a friary before eventually being reburied. His tomb preserved the image of dignity he never had in life. Legacy, misleading but effective. Napoleon, though technically outside the medieval frame, is worth mentioning. He wanted to be remembered not just as a general, but as an emperor on par with Caesar and Charlemagne. His tomb in Paris reflects this, a vast sarcophagus in Les Invalides, surrounded by victorious statues designed to make visitors look down into the crypt in awe. And yet, his true legacy is debated endlessly, tyrant or genius, liberator or dictator. The stone says one thing, history keeps arguing another. Others weren't so lucky. Edward II of England was buried with surprising dignity despite being deposed and, allegedly, murdered. But his legacy, forever overshadowed by rumors of incompetence, favoritism, and a red-hot poker. No tomb, however ornate, could erase that story once it spread. Vanity could also be written in words. Monarchs commissioned chronicles, poems and plays that presented them as heroes. Charlemagne had Einhard. Elizabeth had Spenser's Fairy Queen. Even minor kings paid scribes to polish their reputations. The trouble was, scribes sometimes exaggerated so much that later readers laughed instead of admired. A legacy intended as majesty became parody. Sometimes the attempt at legacy backfired spectacularly. Marie Antoinette tried to present herself as a pastoral queen, building the Hameau de la Reine, a mock peasant village at Versailles. She dressed in simple gowns, posed with sheep, and tried to look humble. Instead, it enraged her subjects. A queen playing milkmaid while real peasants starved was not a winning image. Her legacy project became evidence against her in revolutionary propaganda. Other monarchs aimed smaller. William III of England planted avenues of trees at Hampton Court. Queen Victoria left journals filled with carefully curated reflections. Frederick the Great of Prussia wrote essays on philosophy and music. Each was trying to leave a trace, something beyond battles and treaties. Some succeeded. Others became curiosities, footnotes in biographies. So, what do we learn from these legacies? That monarchs feared obscurity as much as anyone. They just had grander tools to fight it. Palaces, portraits, statues, tombs, they were all pleas to the future. Remember me. Do not let me vanish. And in many ways, it worked. We still visit their palaces, admire their portraits, recite their names. But time is stubborn. For every Louis XIV remembered in mirrors, there's a forgotten archduchess in a convent. For every Elizabeth I immortalized in pearls, there's a sister whose face no one painted. Legacy was never guaranteed. Some monarchs built in marble and still faded. Others built in myth and endured. The irony is that the ones who most wanted to be remembered, those who obsessed over statues and palaces, often remembered for their vanity rather than their virtues. As we drift onward, past tombs and portraits, let's prepare to settle the night. Because our final stop isn't about mistresses, inbreeding, children, tantrums, or legacies. It's about the crowns themselves, heavy, glittering, sometimes absurd hats that sat on very human heads. Our last reflection will be simple, that monarchs, for all their glory, were just people. Fragile, flawed, and often ridiculous. So we've wandered together through candlelit halls, drafty nurseries, and deathbeds perfumed more by illness than by incense. We've seen mistresses discarded, dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own family trees, spoiled children, terrible decisions, eccentric tantrums, contradictions, and forgotten royals who barely mattered at all. What does it all add up to? A reminder, really, that monarchy was never quite what the portraits promised. Crowns looked magnificent, gold, jewels, velvet, heavy symbols of authority blessed by priests, admired by courtiers. But under the crown was always just a head. A human head. One that sweated, ached, and sometimes got lice. The crown didn't stop ulcers from bursting, madness from creeping in, or gangrene from blackening a leg. It didn't protect heirs from dying in cradles, or mistresses from being dismissed at dawn, or queens from miscarrying 17 times in a row. The crown sat on top of it, all glittering, weighty but powerless against time. It's tempting to envy kings and queens, with their palaces, their jewels, their armies of servants. But when you listen closely, their lives sound less enviable. Constantly observed, constantly manipulated. Married to cousins, poisoned by physicians, flattered into stupidity, isolated in grandeur. And even when they tried to carve out meaning-building Versailles, painting themselves ageless, commissioning statues, they revealed their fear. The same fear we all carry, to vanish without being remembered. What makes their stories soothing, perhaps, is that in the end, they were not so different from anyone else. They laughed at silly things. They sulked when ignored. They threw shoes when jealous. They wanted dumplings during revolts. They fussed over napkins. They prayed for children. They worried about wrinkles. They wanted to be remembered. Strip away the velvet, and you see fragile people wearing paperweights on their heads. People who happen to be born in palaces instead of cottages. People whose tantrums echoed louder only because the walls around them were made of marble. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture the portraits fading into candlelight. The mistresses slipping quietly out of court, their Habsburg jaw sagging under its own insistence. The pale child coughing in a nursery, the king shouting about buttons, the queen painting her face with poison, the forgotten princess at her embroidery. All of them human, all of them fragile, all of them wearing crowns that were heavier in symbolism than in gold. And maybe that's the true lesson of history, that royalty was never as golden as it seemed. It was ordinary humanity, dressed up in jewels, stumbling through mistakes, indulgences, and illnesses. Crowns were not shields. They were decorations, paperweights on human heads. So let your own head rest now, without a crown, without the weight of dynasty or legacy. Just the comfort of your pillow, the quiet of the night, and the knowledge that even the mightiest kings and queens were only human after all. Good night.